Bob and Eliza Pancakes are kind of infamous in The Sims 4. Simmers love to debate why these two are together. People look at their traits, their family description, or just the fact that they have separate bedrooms and assume something is wrong. But I don't think the Pancakes are broken. I think they're misunderstood. I like the idea that they're a couple who values independence as much as connection. So today I'm leaning into that idea and taking it a step further by building Bob and Eliza two separate houses, using only Basegame as a way to explore what it looks like when partners choose space, autonomy, and care over traditional expectations. Maybe living apart doesn't mean drifting away. Maybe it's exactly what helps them stay connected. First up, we're going to work on Eliza's house, which is quite a downgrade in size from her last one. I can see Bob and Eliza being house poor in their old shared home. There is no way they'd be able to afford that huge house on just Bob's restaurant paycheck, and I don't think either of them come from any old money to have inherited that house. So since it was out of their price range and living apart would be a better fit for them, they ended up selling that house and each getting their own little homes. That original shared home, though a bit odd, had an ornate southern feel to it before the refresh. Eliza's room in particular had a very pink coquette vibe. So for her individual home, I went with an old South Victorian cottage type style. Eliza seems like the type of sim who wants to come off as well-to-do, but ends up living outside of her means, and all that effort comes off as a bit gaudy at times. So although she is in a much smaller space now, she would want it to look like a larger, fancier house as much as possible. So this one has some of those classic Victorian features, an ornate porch, angled nooks, just shrunk down so that it's almost a little too busy on such a tiny home. It definitely reflects how I see Eliza's personality. It's a bit much and trying a little too hard to be more than it is, but there's something charming about it. For the color of this exterior, I of course had to go with pink overload to match her original bedroom. At least it seems like a lot of pink to me with the siding, the columns, and the railing, but I don't like pink, so I'm probably biased. Maybe it's fine, but it just seems like too much for me. Eliza will love it though. Because this house is so small and I wanted it to have an older feel to it with more separated rooms, the floor plan was quite difficult for me to figure out. I knew I wanted that front room with the alcove to be an art room for Eliza and the side room to be her bedroom. I also know Eliza is absolutely a bath girly, so having a large enough bathroom for a nice tub was a must. She also wouldn't be caught dead in a house with only bar seating and needs space for a formal dining table. So finding space for all that was so challenging. I ended up extending the back wall so that the kitchen could fit in that bump out and make space for the living room and dining room. I also enclosed it since this is an older home and that would be traditional. Personally, I also just like having the kitchen separated from the living and dining areas. I'm very messy when I cook, and I do not need my guests seeing that disaster when they come over. Being able to hide all of that away is definitely ideal. I don't see Eliza as a messy sim, but she is someone who wants to curate a very particular aesthetic in her home, so she'd want to hide away all the more utilitarian items of a kitchen. Despite tucking the kitchen into its own alcove, there was still not enough space for the main part of the house to fit a large bathroom, dining area, and living room with a fireplace. You may be thinking, well, just cut the bathtub or shrink the dining table, but we are talking about Eliza Pancakes here. She's a woman who has very strong preferences and will settle for nothing less. No way in hell is she compromising on any of that. Props to you, Eliza. I think many of us could stand to be more embodied in our desires and our standards, so although it was quite the pain in the ass, I was not going to let her down. After much trial and error, I finally figured it out. I ended up adding another extension to the house between the kitchen and bedroom for the bathroom. This allowed me to make it an ensuite, which Eliza will love, and also give it a pass-through door into the kitchen so that guests could use it without going through her bedroom. With the space for a bathtub taken care of, I was even able to fit in a little half bath off of the dining room and a hallway connecting Eliza's bedroom to her studio. And with that, I had finally finished the floor plan and checked off everything on her must-have list. Finding a house with all of these features in such a small footprint was probably hell for her realtor. I could even see Eliza getting fed up with all of them, trying to pressure her into settling, and going off and finding her dream house all on her own. Go off, girl, you've got this. Moving on to decorating finally, we'll work on the kitchen first. I initially went with pink in here. I wanted the walls to be tiled, but I couldn't find one I liked since I was only using Basegame in this build. Instead, I ended up going with painted walls that have a nice molding on them. In their original kitchen, they had a tea maker, which I see being Eliza, so I put the same one in here for her. I I added in a few green accent pieces around too, since green seems to be one of her favorite colors. I wanted to pay a bit more homage to that original kitchen, so I did end up changing the walls to be yellow instead, since that was the color in their other kitchen, though I went with a much softer shade here. I also changed the floors to be a checkerboard pattern, like in the original, again just in a lighter colorway. Eventually I hung up some of those flip-flop string lights above the sink window as a nod to Eliza's iconic purple sandals. Although Eliza tries hard to seem all sophisticated and classy, I like to think that at her heart she's got some lowbrow taste too. Like, her family wasn't well off growing up and had a kind of tacky style, so even though Eliza tries to distance herself from it, she's still got a bit of that in her. In the living room, I liked that green and pink rug, so I used that as the basis for the decor in here. That green trolley fit in really well, and I thought it'd make a great piece to put on the fireplace mantle, but for some reason it doesn't slot to anything and can only be placed on the floor. I haven't tried my CC red shelf, but even that was not compatible with it. I ended up just having to raise it with the 9 key. If you look closely, you can see that it's floating above the mantle ever so slightly, but I'm choosing to ignore that. The Pancakes original house has an easel and woodworking table, and while I was reading up on the wiki, it says that Eliza will often roll once to use these items, implying that she hopes to be a self-employed artist. So I ran with that by giving her a painting studio. To further lean into this and compensate for the lack of decor options in Basegame, I decorated her house with a bunch of the classical and impressionism paintings your Sims can make. Trying to decorate these Basegame only houses for Bob and Eliza had me realize just how limited and dated the decor items are. Like, unless you're planning on building a stuffy old house or a weird early 2000s bar, you're gonna probably struggle. I've lived through the time when The Sims 4 first came out, and I still do not get why they went with this selection of items. Most of it wouldn't have even been in style back then, from what I remember. So yeah, for all you Basegame only players, they really did you dirty. My hope is that you found some great CC to compensate, because the in-game selection is pretty limiting. This place was looking too old and stuffy with all of the antique furniture, so to try to modernize it a bit, I mixed in a few more contemporary pieces. The big change was swapping out those ornate love seats for more modern ones. I also changed the ceiling lights to be smaller, since those bigger ones were kind of distracting and old-fashioned. I then went through and hung up a few more of the paintings that I'm pretending Eliza made herself. That beachy, flowery one in her bathroom is like the perfect Eliza Pancakes painting to me. I also love the slightly gaudy, small flamenco and flower paintings that are in the kitchen. Those also read very Eliza to me, and I wish we had more like these that I could put up in here. I'm envisioning craft show artists, pastel landscapes, or bright flower paintings for her style. Moving on to the landscaping now, I wanted to keep it simple as I don't see Eliza doing extensive yard work. I put in a bunch of bushes along the foundation, since those would look nice but be easy to upkeep. That little porch bump out is a cute feature, so to highlight it, I planted a bunch of sunflowers around it. I can see sunflowers being Eliza's favorite flower. To bring in more of that pink from the house, I also sprinkled in some of those pink flower patches around the yard. Then to round out the landscaping, I planted a couple of trees to finish things off. Okay, let's move on to Bob's place now. My vision for Bob's house is that he moved into the apartment above his uncle's local barbecue restaurant. I wish we had a more densely packed neighborhood of these shotgun houses that was intermixed with small commercial lots, so that this restaurant would fit in more naturally. But it is what it is, and I think this place fits in well enough. Maybe there used to be more shops at the end of this road, but they got torn down or something. Willow Creek gives Louisiana, Georgia, South Carolina vibes, so I went with something you might find in one of their old downtowns for the style of this build. With the big double-story wraparound porch and tall shuttered windows, it's definitely on theme for this world. I wanted this place to look older and a little rough around the edges, so I went with dark woods and worn bricks. To integrate this place more into the surrounding world, I found the best matched cement tile I could find and used that to connect the patio to the sidewalk that wraps around the corner of the lot. This helped make this place seem less out of place. Now this type of building would have likely been butted up next to another one, but since I didn't really have the space to do that here, I instead put an extension on the side to house the kitchen. Adding that did help balance this place out more. On the top floor is Bob's 1-bedroom, 1-bathroom apartment. Bob doesn't have strong preferences like Eliza does, and is fine with just working with whatever he's given. Now this place is much more simple. His living area is tiny, but he still has nice, comfortable seating. He also has a big TV, as is custom for a bachelor pad. He doesn't have a proper dining room, but I don't think he minds having the bar seating and probably enjoys the proximity to the kitchen for ease of serving people food while he cooks. Despite the lack of space, he does have a nice kitchen. With him loving cooking, this was probably the main priority for his place, and so long as that's good, he'd be fine with whatever else. There was an empty space behind the bar seating, so I used that to extend his kitchen by adding in a coffee bar back there. In the kitchen, I hung up some really nice copper pots and pans and fancy knives for him too. The space in the entry hallway was tight, but I fit in a coat rack and a wall phone. That calendar collage has a photo that looks like it could be Eliza, so I hung that up over there too. I couldn't make a Bob Pancakes house without hanging up his poster, so I put that over his coffee bar. I'm thinking that this poster is from some sort of a local advertisement Bob was in. Maybe his family's restaurant does a pancake brunch on Sundays and they use Bob as their poster child for it. Or perhaps some bigwig from the regional pancake mix factory saw him around and thought he'd be the perfect average man to be the face of their latest campaign. The money from that gig could be how he and Eliza bought that big house, but as that money dwindled away, they had to downsize. The tagline that he's the least interesting man in the world is not very flattering, but Bob is perfectly fine with being boring, and now he's a local celebrity of sorts. Now I know that the Pancakes are portrayed as this mismatched couple whose relationship is on the rocks, especially because of the separate bedrooms thing, which is a false equivalency. More couples than you think have separate bedrooms for many valid reasons that have nothing to do with the strength of their relationship. Sometimes your partner or your partner snore, or they move a lot at night, or you have different schedules, or whatever. It was also not an uncommon arrangement for like the mid-1800s up until the 1950s. So yeah, there's nothing wrong with having separate bedrooms. But anyways, Eliza often gets the brunt of the blame for their rocky relationship, which I totally do not agree with, and a lot of the arguments have a whiff of sexism to me. Is she a bit of a steamroller? Sure, but in my headcanon for her, there's a reason for that. But even without that, she's totally valid in being fed up with lazy, inattentive men. I am looking at you, Bob. So many of us, especially female-identified or raised people, were socialized to be meek and accommodating, so seeing Eliza push in for her needs and desires without hesitation, especially in an abrasive way, is refreshing, and I'm down with supporting her wrongs. Do Bob and Eliza have the healthiest relationship? No, but I do still think they have a solid one which they work hard to maintain, imperfect as it may be. In my headcanon for them, they grew up and went through a lot of difficult things together, so they've got a really strong connection to each other, even though they're not the missing puzzle piece type of a match. They got married young and tried to do the whole living together thing for a while, but they're both quite independent and private people, so that arrangement just never meshed well for them. So living apart makes the most sense for their relationship and individual preferences. Just because they had separate bedrooms before and are choosing to live apart now doesn't mean their relationship is any weaker. In fact, it probably takes a lot more intentionality and secure attachment to maintain a relationship like this than it does when you naturally see the other person or other people in your relationship daily because you're just always together by default. Their relationship may be a bit messy, but they have a really solid foundation, and in my opinion, they're the true OG ride or die couple in The Sims 4. Jumping from a crumbling, mismatched relationship to a ride or die couple bucking tradition is a big leap to make, but these are the Pancakes in my game, and I love my own storyline. It's not really supported by anything canon, but in my heart, it is true. Do y'all have any out there headcanons for this game that aren't really supported by anything, but you still hold them to be true in your own mind? Back to the build now. At the rear of the building, I gave Bob an outdoor lounging spot in a little garden area. Bob is lazy, but he loves cooking, so I imagine he does some pretty hands-off gardening and grows some hot peppers and herbs and whatever else will sort of grow on its own back here, either for the restaurant or his personal kitchen. On the sidewalk, there's a few picnic tables and a chess set. I see this being the main hangout spot for the neighborhood. On any given day, there's going to be some people hanging out at the tables, chatting, and the local old-timers will be playing chess and listening to the radio all day long. For the landscaping, I kept it pretty simple and a little unkempt looking with some overgrown grasses, ivy patches, and red wildflowers in the front garden bed. This is a small, cheap, local spot that does not have the money nor the time to be doing much with the landscaping out here. Inside the restaurant, I continued those casual, unfussy vibes. There's dated checkerboard tiles and worn wood on the floor and sort of dingy looking panels on the wall. The picnic tables are the main seating in here too, but I also added in a counter and stools in front of the window to the kitchen. Since I'm only using Basegame, this restaurant is not functional. I thought about leaving it empty down here, but you know me, and I could not resist being a bit extra with my decorating. I really wanted to sell the vision of Bob living above an old local dive, and thought it could be really fun to play in here still by having Bob throw some dinner parties in this restaurant space. If you do have dine out, it should be easy enough to swap out a few things and make this a functional restaurant too. To make this place feel more like a restaurant, I hung those chalkboard wall signs so that they look like they're sitting on the table and leaning against the wall to act as our menus, which I think works pretty well for the mom and pop style place we're decorating here. I also made a neat collage wall that's made up of an ever-growing collection of old newspapers that have significant local stories on them. Then also on that wall, I hung up a bunch of memorabilia. There's some awards the restaurant won, photos of the founders, and other knickknacks. In the corner by the door to the kitchen, I put a station with extra condiments, seasonings, and utensils. Above it is a bulletin board where everyone posts all the events and news going on around the neighborhood. Last up is the kitchen. In my mind, this place is an old barbecue joint. Since I am not using dine out, I can't actually set a menu to reflect this, but to get the idea across, I put in a grill instead of an oven back here. Just pretend the windows are open and this place has excellent ventilation. Having upper cabinets made this place feel too much like a home kitchen, so instead I put in open shelving that matched the butcher block countertops. I really wish that I had more clutter options to work with to really fill in these shelves, but I made do with the options in Basegame that I had, and I think it turned out well. There's extra spices, some potted herbs, binders with family recipes, fresh bread for sandwiches, and even a boombox with CDs for the kitchen staff to jam out while they work. Alright, let's go ahead and hop over to live mode and take a tour of the finished homes for both of our pancakes and see how they like their new places. Here we are at Eliza's finished pastel pink cottage. It looks super sweet, too sweet for me, but hey, it suits her. She has a prime spot on the front porch here for her to sit and keep an eye on all of her neighbors' business. With how nosy she is, I'm sure you'll be able to find her out here on most days. She has a couple garden pots on the side yard and a woodworking bench on the back porch for her to work on her sculpting. Inside, you walk into this entry room that leads off into two directions. Straight goes into the main living space, but then going this way, you enter into her studio, which is covered with tons of her paintings. Through this book alcove, you go into her bedroom. It is very similar vibes to her original bedroom before the refresh. The painting over the toilet looks like it should be the cover for some sappy novel, which fits so well with the artist I imagine her to be. This passes through into the pastel yellow kitchen. There's a more cheesy book cover-like art in here, which pairs so nicely with her flip-flop lights. Out here is her precious looking dining and living space. It's giving Southern China doll in here to me. Eliza definitely has the granny core decor on lock. Alright, let's head across the way to Bob's house. Here is Bob's apartment and family's barbecue joint. I took inspo from his robe and put pops of red everywhere around here. Around the side here is the entrance to his apartment. There is Bob's secluded nap spot he sneaks off to on his breaks. Up the stairs, he's got a huge wraparound porch for chilling out on his days off. His place is simpler, but it has plenty of sentimental touches. He has lots of pictures of his friends and family and sunflowers for Eliza. It's a bit messy around the edges, but he wouldn't want to live in a place that feels too neat, which I can relate to. I just wish we had a few more items in Basegame to help make builds feel a little messier. I also gave him a tragic clown painting because Bob just seems like the kind of guy to have one of these. I can also see him hanging out with them and cooking up some pancakes or grilling some burgers for them on his porch. The lower level has his family's little restaurant. More pops of red against worn dark woods in here. It's that run-down local spot you'd pass up unless you live around here. You know those sketchy dives where the food is either gonna get you sick or it's gonna be the best meal you've had all week? That's this place's vibe, but it's got the good food for sure. Again, I wish there was more base game items to make it a bit more grody and run down looking, but I did what I could and hopefully the idea comes across. And with that, you've seen everything. Their odd, divisive household is part of the namesake for my channel, so I had a lot of fun making these houses for them. Building with base game only was also an interesting challenge. It's not my normal style, but it did help make building much quicker for me since there were so many less options. If you have ideas for other limited pack builds, let me know. Right now I'm thinking a plant sim cult compound, but I'm not sure what packs to use for that. Or maybe an alien and servo Pueblo style housing complex with Strangerville. Yeah, let me know what you want to see. If you stuck it out this far, you definitely should give this video a like and maybe even subscribe for more videos like this. I would love to have you here. Thank you so much for watching. Remember, be kind to yourself today, and I'll see you next time.